You are very welcome to this one question Q&A, and it's almost time for Christmas, and so I hope at this point, as much as life allows, there is more magic than stress in your world, and you're very welcome to this one question Q&A about the prospect of peace negotiations now, and why I either don't like that idea or ignore talking about it. And several questions were found in my untrawled through unanswered pages and pages of emails that I'm committed to getting to over time. And the last version of that question, I think, came from Joseph. And Joe, asked, Vlad, are you evading the issue of negotiation? Let's put a few things on the table that help frame this. And I don't want to do anything knockdown in this, especially in this state that I'm in. So I'll just put a few brushes of paint on the canvas. The relation to the world of the Putin regime is divided at least along two categories. The first is an expression of a kind of civilizational turn that Putin took in 2012, 2014, however you want to date it. I dated between 2010 and 2012, actually. And that's to do with expressing a kind of challenge to the West, waiting for the West to be weak enough not to be able to deal with that challenge, and reconfiguring Russia's place on the world stage, and thereby expressing some kind of quasi-mystical civilizational self-realization that Russia has been prevented from living out. One category, one lane. Another lane is outsourcing war as a way of stabilizing the regime and retaining power. A warring regime is a regime that's likely to stay in power longer. That's an important logic too in the Kremlin. That's part of why the story that started in 2014 started. Now, that set of categories and lanes, once properly elaborated, would lead me to conclude that roughly, cartoonishly speaking, the telos of this regime is war. That this is a regime that is going to either be engaging in war, or preparing for war, or, if capacity doesn't allow, aspiring toward war. I don't think that telos, and I think I called the regime a kind of inescapable escalation machine, which couldn't stop its escalation even if Putin wanted to. So the telos of this regime is war, and quite a lot needs to be said before that becomes plausible, but that's my assessment, my analysis. If we translate this kind of statement of the Kremlin's relation to the world into its war aims, we can see something, if you like, temporary or tactical there. That is, while they still want Kiev, while they still want the reconfiguring of the world order, that's not accessible to them now, they know that. So what they want now is a pause, a break, a ceasefire that is based on acceptance of Crimea and the annexed territories as Russian. They do not want that as a stopping point. They want that as a pause. And the point of the pause is to rearm, and the rearming might mean that you rearm with much more basic weapons, much more basic technologies, because the more sophisticated ones have been used up to a good extent and cannot be remade. But the point is to rearm and go again. That is, to me, not obvious, because I don't like saying that things are obvious, and you know that, especially if you saw my Chomsky video. But that is almost obvious. That is almost obvious. So, you see, this kind of a sketch about what we're dealing with the Kremlin doesn't leave us inclined to think favorably of sitting down and negotiating now. And Ukraine has no interest in this. Ukraine is interested in a very big goal that is probably a fantasy, but fantasies are human, and a more pragmatic goal. The more pragmatic goal is to press a military advantage as far as possible and then continue building up military strength and arrive at some kind of arrangement with Russia. But do that from a maximal position of strength. So until such a point is reached, Ukraine isn't interested in negotiation. Or it's not interested in negotiation until it thinks that such a point is unreachable. The bigger goal Ukraine has is revolution in Russia and the dissolution of Russia. Either the breakup of Russia or just the disappearance of Russia as a major global political player. That's an aspiration that Ukraine shares with other East European countries, but it doesn't share it with France or Germany or the United States. The United States just would prefer a fairly Western-friendly regime in the Kremlin that doesn't do wars. That's it. The aspirations of the United States are not clear beyond the preservation of Ukraine as an independent state. So whatever it takes to do that, the United States is committed to doing this. But there isn't a clear idea about what happens after an interruption in the war is reached or some kind of a deal is reached, or what happens after we are in a state where it's clear that there is going to be peace prevailing for quite a while, and Russia is too weak to break it. What happens to Ukraine then? The United States doesn't have a strategy for that. But it is certainly committed to Ukraine getting itself into a stronger position than it has now. And negotiating then. But this is a very, very fine balance. This is a very, very fine balance, because if you look at Crimea, then Crimea actually links, and the prospect, I'm not saying it's likely because it's not, but the prospect of Ukraine taking Crimea links Ukraine's more pragmatic aspiration of getting into a better place and then negotiating, pushing Russia back to pre-Feb 24 scenario, maybe then being open to talks. But the bigger aim, the bigger fantasy, is indeed Russia's disappearance as a major player in revolution in Russia. And practically taking Crimea strongly implies that. Because Ukraine taking Crimea is reconcilable, but barely reconcilable with the Putin regime surviving as it is. Now, it might reconstitute itself in some way, but that too would need to be a kind of revolution. It might be a radical junta that come in, for instance, but it'll be very difficult for the regime to keep going as it's going if Ukraine takes Crimea. So we've put a few things on the table, and I think that touches on the sorts of things we would discuss if we were talking about the prospect of negotiations now, which I think isn't a good idea unless you want to play into the hands of terroristic Russian aggression backed by genocidal rhetoric. And unfortunately, that is what Jeffrey Sachs has really ended up doing, including going on Russian propaganda podcast with Solovyov, which is a really, 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 really awkward punch in the face, self-administered punch in the face for Sachs. And really an expression of arrogance and ignorance, but I absolutely will defend his right to be platformed everywhere. I don't want to cancel him in any way for this. So that's it. I am in an interesting place at the moment with some challenges. I've not needed medical intervention in the last few days, but it's been a tricky period, and this shows that certainly as far as the chat channel goes, it doesn't mean we have to stop interacting. And of course, there's a hope for something very interesting on the main channel, not unrelated to some of the things we've just talked about, including Crimea. Lots of love, and talk very soon.